You ever have a place that's just yours? A tiny piece of the world you've paid for, swept, fixed, and finally figured out how to breathe in. Mine was a backyard pool tucked behind a split-level house on a sleepy cul-de-sac in Cedar Ridge blue tile, a cracked diving board I'd never use, a hammock strung between two oaks, and a little strip of lawn where my kids used to chase each other until they moved out. That pool was quiet, a small island of normal after a long day. And then one Wednesday morning, everything that made sense about it got scooped up and shaken like a snow globe. She started as Inconvenience Marla Whitcomb, the head of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association, all sharp cardigan and clipped smile, like she'd swallowed a rule book for breakfast and chewed it with relish. The first time she crossed my backyard without knocking, I thought maybe she got the wrong house. She was wearing a white sun hat, sunglasses, and a look like she belonged in a parade of primroses. Community resource, she told me, as if my backyard were just a public green like the mailbox. We need to keep things accessible. She stepped right into my pool, sank into an inflatable, and started reading a newsletter I'd never seen printed before. I asked her to leave. She smiled and said, "Ethan, you know how this neighborhood works." I didn't feel like fighting not that day, so I closed the patio door and watched from the glass, feeling the first cold prick of something that became 2, then 3, then 100 pricks. The realization that this wasn't about a pool, it was about power. It escalated like a sitcom, turned slow-burn thriller. Towels left on my lawn in the morning, footprints traced in the dew, a plastic margarita glass sunk at the deep end. Every time I confronted Marla, she had a public-spirited reason, a reference to community use, or she'd call it a misunderstanding and pivot the room like a stage actor. When I started documenting camera on the eve, motion alerts, timestamps, she smiled for the camera like a celebrity caught at the wrong angle. Then the HOA board started sending letters. The language was absurdly specific, like it had been written to be ridiculous. My fence was 2 inches too tall, my pool water too blue, my deck boards too cheerful. Violation, it said in formal red type. Correct immediately. Neighbors drifted into the background like extras. Phil from next door would wave from his driveway and look away. Tessa at 14 Cedar Ridge would pretend not to hear the arguments through the hedges. People were busy or scared or both. Marla's authority felt surgical, not just rules on paper, but a steady, quiet erosion of the idea that you owned your own life. I tried the polite route. I went to board meetings. I sat in a fluorescent room full of folding chairs and stale coffee and watched Marla speak with a certainty like she had practiced indignation. "We're stewards of this community," she said. "We have to make decisions for the greater good." I asked for evidence, for bylaws that allowed someone to paddle in another person's pool like it was a public pond. The board filed hands like they were holding invisible marbles, hesitant, not wanting to drop them. The room went quiet, and somewhere in that silence I felt the tilt of the world move. There's a moment in every confrontation where an ordinary person has to decide if they'll keep calling the police or if they'll do something else, something that doesn't break the law but does break the momentum. For me, that moment had a frame. A towel on my patio, sun at an angle that would light anyone who walked through my yard like they were in a spotlight, and Marla's voice on my door. It was stupid, petty, and perhaps a little theatrical, but we'd all been living in a slow, public erasure of boundaries, and it was getting personal. So I planned a reveal. Not an attack. Never that. I've never been the kind of person who wanted to hurt another. I wanted the truth to be undeniable, theatrical enough that the neighbors would remember it the way you remember a song stuck in your head, and precise enough that the HOA couldn't sweep it under the beige carpet of bureaucracy. I dyed the pool. Not hazardous, nothing illegal, just a bright, electric cobalt dye used for pond shows, safe for people, for pets, for pool filters. I set cameras, one under the eave, one in the oak aimed like a theater spotlight, my phone tucked in my pocket for the close-up. I left a towel and a paperback by the hammock bait dressed as accident and sat back with my coffee like a man waiting to see if the sun would rise. The bait worked. Of course it did. Marla couldn't resist a scene. She stepped into my yard like she had a right to pluck daisies, and when she saw the dye in the water she laughed, a short sound like a belt being snapped. "You really think this proves anything?" she asked. She set the towel down, adjusted her sunglasses, and went for the float like she was reclaiming a throne. I watched the angle of her shoulders, the way she folded the magazine across her knees. Then, because she'd always done it, walked past the boundary. As if it were non-existent, she climbed the ladder and duff. She came up from the water, and the silence dropped like a curtain. Blue streaked her swimsuit, blue across her shoulders, blue in her hairline, electric and undeniable. Phones clicked like rain. The neighbor who never gets involved dropped his grocery bag and held his phone, eyes wide. Tessa from 14 Cedar Ridge leaned over her fence and shouted, "You crazy, Marla." Somebody laughed, and then someone else yelled, and footage began to travel. A 30-second clip, a grainy vertical that would move faster than I could have imagined. Her face when she realized the blue wasn't coming off the way makeup washes off was a thing I can't unsee, equal parts fury and humiliation, and, I think, the first moment she truly understood the cost of the story she'd been telling herself. After that, the logic that had protected her peeled away. The board met the next week, and the meeting room smelled of pretzels and civic fatigue. Marla tried to speak in the same steady cadence she always used, but people interrupted. Phil from next door, who could name every dog on the street and thought HOA meetings were about mailboxes, stood and said, "That's my pool. That's my neighbor's life. We can't have someone walking over people." Tessa posted the video, and it spread. People who had been quiet online started typing furious paragraphs. Others started telling their own stories about petty rule enforcement and public shaming. The footage wasn't mean, it was simply honest in a way that rules and lawyers and committee memos aren't. Evidence has a nasty habit of being clear. The board voted. They removed Marla as president. They instituted a review of who could access common resources and under what conditions. They voted like people who had been startled awake by a noise in the night and realized it was coming from inside the house. Marla moved out within the year, listing her house with a photograph that tried too hard to be charming. The cul-de-sac breathed again, and I thought for a good while that the story ended there. Things don't end like that. They thicken. The neighborhood changed, sure, but people remembered how easy it had been for someone to take power and how slow it had been to push back. Others looked at me like I'd staged some elaborate prank, and I had. But I also felt a strange kinship with anyone who's ever had to make a loud, undeniable point just to get listened to. I felt the old wounds of being ignored in meetings, of being lectured by people who'd never mowed my lawn, settle, and then begin to scar. What I learned, and what I hope you'll take from this in whatever neighborhood you live in, is that boundaries need more than signs and bylaws. They need witnesses. They need people who will stand up and say, "That's mine," or sometimes, "That's not yours to take." They need the small courage to document when something's wrong, and the larger courage to be embarrassing if embarrassment is what it takes to stop someone who's slowly eroding what belongs to you. So, tell me, have you ever had a space taken from you? Not with force, but with the quiet march of someone else's sense of entitlement? What did you do? If you were there on Cedar Ridge watching that blue splash, would you have laughed, filmed, or stood on your porch and hoped it would all go away? Drop your thoughts below. Tell me what justice looks like to you, and if you've ever been the person who had to make a scene to be heard, say that too. Share the video if it makes you think twice about the power dynamics in your own little corner of the world.